Welcome to Literary Hangover. I'm Matt Leck, with me Alex Guns.
Hello.
We have a spooky episode for you today in light of the upcoming Halloween, which is, I don't know, I like to call it one of my favorite holidays, but I never like to do anything for it, really, as far as like preparation goes.
Yeah, I like that it is happening. I was walking to work the other day and I was walking past some of the nicest townhouses in Manhattan on 5th Avenue and between 5th and Madison on 81st Street. And they had decked out their like $20 million house with like cobwebs and stuff like that. And these like two middle-aged women are outside that one of them clearly owns it. And one turned while I was walking past, one turned to the other and she was like, "It is a bit spooky, no?" And then the other one turned and went, "Yeah, but it's just in good fun." It's just like,
yeah, as long as you remember that.
Yeah.
Don't let it get too crazy.
Even the rich just like to have a good time and celebrate the dead on Halloween.
Yeah, well, remember young Goodman Brown's foray into the forest, where he sees Goody Cloyce, an accused witch in the Salem Witch Trials.
Yep.
That took place on Halloween night, or whatever they called it back then.
All Hallows Eve.
So yeah, we're in the lead up. Then this is also preparation for the Crucible episode. But the thing is the Crucible is, I think it's commendable in the way it, packages history in a digestible form, but it's not history. So we want to do a separate episode. The more I looked into it, the more I thought, there's stuff to talk about here. And especially in this sort of loosely chronological journey we're taking through, American literature. I thought it would be a interesting place to start. There's a lot of intersections with previous works that we've touched on. I mean, most recently, Hobomok features the arrival of the Arbella, the ship in 1630, in which sort of Anne Bradstreet and Simon Bradstreet arrived on, and Simon Bradstreet would have a role to play in his old age in the Salem Witch Trials, or he would relinquish his role to Judge Stoughton, who was a nutcase, Harvard graduate. A lot of these people are Harvard graduates.
Yeah, that's weird that keeps happening.
That shouldn't be lost on people. Harvard's legacy here is very, very bad.
Yeah, I mean, we have a Harvard grad who shows up here to record every now and again. I think that's proof enough that
Grace is a Harvard grad.
She's a Harvard grad. She says she went to school.
I wish that was disclosed to me.
I went to school in Massachusetts or whatever, which is what all Harvard grads say.
Oh my god!
Just like Zuckerberg or whoever else.
I thought maybe Oxford or Cambridge or something, but not Harvard. She's canceled from literary. No, she'll be back for the next George Orwell stuff. But we also have Mary Rowlandson. The way she describes Native Americans in her possession, in her getting kidnapped by them in King Philip's War. This is from the very early on in her narrative here. "It is a solemn sight to see so many Christians lying in their blood, some here and some there, like a company of sheep torn by wolves, all of them stripped naked by a company of hellhounds." So Native Americans are hellhounds. "Roaring, singing, ranting, and insulting, as if they would have torn our very hearts out. Yet the Lord, by his almighty power, preserved a number of us from death." So you see the connection between Native Americans and Satan is one that gets very developed in this time period. Basically you got King Philip's War, and then after King Philip's War, you end up having King William's War in Maine, which has the French and the Wabanaki Indians versus the English colonies, who were basically not adhering to what they said they do at the end of King Philip's War. So let's play a few sections from this. I have three main texts that I've used to sort of orient myself here. The one that we'll get to first is by Francis Hill. It's called A Delusion of Satan, the full story of the Salem Witch Trials, which is more of a sort of straight narrative one, but it goes over a lot of different things. And I thought this part on the sort of fear of Native Americans around King Philip's War and the aftermath kind of sets the table for that. It should be mentioned that in the King William's War up in Maine, there's a number of refugees that came to Salem Village after, to escape, Native American sackings and raids of their villages, including George Burroughs, probably the most famous person executed, who was a Salem minister a couple times in the 1680s. But as we'll see, the average lifespan or career of a minister in New England was about 22 years. And Salem went through, they had Bailey, Burrough twice, Deodat Lawson, and then Samuel Paris. So we'll get into sort of why it was so fractious. But it was. And so George Burrough came back, and a number of the girls were actually refugees from the war, too.
Mary Walcott had lost her mother when she was 8. Elizabeth Hubbard was an orphan, as was Mercy Lewis. We do not know how Elizabeth's parents died, but we do know that Mercy saw her parents slaughtered by Indians. This happened 3 years before, in Maine. The area then known as Maine was part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It covered roughly the same land area as today's state of that name, and was remote, dangerous territory, also known as the Eastward. Mercy had been lucky to escape with her life. All these girls, from the loss of one or both parents as well as cultural conditioning, were as susceptible to hysteria as are the physically weak to disease. And the inhabitants of Salem Village, having endured extreme anxiety and hardship over the past several years, were also susceptible, not to hysteria, but to extreme irrational fear. The defences of common sense, skepticism, and a sense of proportion had been lowered not only by Puritan fanaticism, but also by continual stress, virtually out of existence. Like the rest of the colonists, the villagers had suffered smallpox epidemics, a political upheaval that threw the ownership of their lands into question, and the constant threat of attacks from the Indians. For everyone at that time, death was...
Maybe we should get into those political upheavals quick before we go any further. So, how would you go?
Creepy.
Yeah. How would you sort of set the table on what's going on politically in New England and maybe England generally with this?
So the Massachusetts Bay Colony at this point was the genesis of this idea was largely from a group of Puritans that decided that England can never be purified, and they have to leave to start not only over again for themselves, but start the world over again. They thought of their mission in quite cosmic terms. At the same time that they're building up a quite profitable venture at this point in New England, England goes to hell, basically, through a ugly civil war, fighting out the same problem, which is like Anglicans versus Puritans, but then also ideas of democratic leadership versus monarchy. And it ends up, there's a Puritan republic for 10 years that falls apart, and then the monarchy is restored. But then that monarchy isn't Anglican, it's actually Catholic, or has the possibility of being Catholic. And that...
Popish, we would say.
Yeah, and that's a popish plot because then you are ruled by Rome. Because the new monarch, who is the son of the monarch that they killed, Charles II, comes in. He grew up in France, and turns out he has Catholic sympathies, which isn't an issue because he has a Protestant wife, but then he has a son, and all of a sudden, we're going to be under a Catholic monarchy, which means we're going to be ruled by Italians, which is a non-go.
Nightmare scenario.
Yeah, so they have a soft civil war, again, essentially called the Glorious Revolution, and they oust their own monarch, and they bring in William and Mary from what would now be Germany. But Mary is the sister of Charles II. So it's that's the relation right there. That's enough for us. So at this time, also the Massachusetts Bay Colony is rising in power and also shrinking in power depending on who's in charge in England, which is largely up for grabs in a 40-year period.
Now, can I just point out here, does the Massachusetts Bay Colony Puritans have a sort of how England was able to keep their own currency in the euro, but was also part of the euro?
Yeah.
Am I understanding the distinction between the Puritans and the Separatists, right? And the Separatists were we don't want any kind of relationship at all. And the Puritans were oh, we want that charter because we want these lands and that sort of thing to be sort of under the... Because they have some relationship to royalty, even though it gets, as we will find out, more problematic. But is that sort of the thing that they kind of had their cake and were eating it?
Yeah, a little bit. It's all about percentages, right? Separatists would have been 0, nothing, not at all. We don't want any part of English culture, whereas Puritans are English culture is valuable, but it needs to be purified, basically, with a lack of a better word.
Right.
And so, yeah, they were totally willing to be like, we're going to work for the king because, or whoever is in charge, because they're damned anyways. But we would like to use their material goods for the most part. And we would love to trade with them because the Massachusetts Bay Colony would be nothing without English trade. Like, it's not a symbiotic relationship yet. It's a parasitic relationship.
And we could talk about that trade is what makes New England valuable at this point is basically as a source for like timber and grain and like cod for slave colonies in the Caribbean.
Yeah. So there's like different new markets that are opening up.
Opportunities.
Yeah. There's new opportunities that are opening up that is aiding and helping the Massachusetts Bay Colony become as powerful as it is.
Yeah. And so basically in 1684, Charles II revokes the charter that so that they get forced into Brexit.
Yeah. But I don't think it's mentioned in one of those books, but part of that charter, that original charter, is that they have a right to secede if they want to. That's in the charter. And so that's
a bad thing to put in the charter.
Yeah, you don't know why you'd write that down.
Yeah.
They learned their lesson the second time being like, we're just going to do it.
Yeah. But so this guy Andros gets put in charge of the colony as it's like a new federation of New England. I forget exactly what it's called.
It creates New Hampshire. They lose the land that is now New Hampshire is created into a separate colony.
To weaken basically Massachusetts, right?
Yeah.
And Andros is comes in as like the king's representative, governor, and he's like, you have to be nice to the Quakers, you have to allow Catholics to pray, you have to swear in a Bible, which the Puritans did not like, and also we're going to enforce these navigation acts for a trade. And Puritans like, none of that is cool with us, actually.
How about I go fucking insane?
So basically he gets cooed out of there during the William of Orange, and I don't know how much we want to get into that. Or do we want to play that? You said
a
clip?
Yeah. I've seen it before, and it's a good brisk overview. I think it might be just long enough.
This is a 3-minute history by Jabsy.
In 1651, Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector of England after winning the English Civil War, a conflict caused by religious tensions and over the balance of power between king and parliament. However, shortly after Cromwell died, the monarchy under Charles II was restored in 1660. Charles II inherited the long-standing tensions between king and parliament, religious issues, and a rivalry with the Dutch Republic, a nation he would fight 2 wars against. But religion was the chief issue. For instance, Charles attempted to extend religious freedoms, but the Clarendon Code was passed and this ended tolerations of dissenting religions. Then, in 1679, anti-Catholic violence erupted because of a false conspiracy accusing Catholics of plotting to kill the king. This, the Popish plot, also brought the succession of the crown into question. This was because Charles's Catholic brother James was set to inherit the throne and many demanded that he should be excluded from it. The ensuing exclusion crisis saw Parliament split and a 2-party system emerge. Whigs called for James to be excluded, whereas the Tories supported him. The exclusion crisis ended when King Charles dissolved Parliament, and then, in 1683, a group of Whigs were found guilty of planning to assassinate the king and his brother as part of the Rye House plot. James's popularity increased because of the plot, so when Charles died, James inherited the throne in 1685. But soon after taking power, an illegitimate child of Charles, the Duke of Monmouth, launched a rebellion to try and claim the throne for himself. The Monmouth rebellion was crushed in a couple of months, however James began to lose support once again. People feared the increase of the standing army and didn't like his push for religious equality with the Declaration of Indulgence. Yet many saw Catholic rule in England as only temporary because his successor was his Protestant daughter Mary, and she was married to the Protestant Prince of Orange and Stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, William III. But this changed in June 1688 when James had a son, thus starting a Catholic dynasty. So 7 notable Englishmen, the immortal 7.
Feudalism is so awesome.
Well, just an entire nation's economy and well-being is well, as long as it doesn't have a kid, it's all right.
Yeah, exactly.
And then he does all right, it's on.
Invited William of Orange to land an army in England and claim the throne while they rose up in support of him. William had entertained the idea for some time because the Dutch Republic and a lot of Europe was threatened by the expansionist policies of Louis XIV of France. An anti-French alliance had been formed in Europe, the League of Augsburgs, but William still couldn't afford to see an Anglo-French alliance. So, when his ally, the Holy Roman Empire, agreed to protect the Dutch Republic, he set sail for England. William issued the Declaration of the Hague, promising to only defend the Protestant faith before landing on the south coast in mid-November 1688. Although William had tens of thousands of men, he avoided confrontation and just waited for the English to turn against their king. Protestant mobs rioted across the country and the army and nobles switched allegiances. Realizing his position and fearful of execution, James fled the country in early December. William and his wife Mary were crowned the following February and passed the Bill of Rights. This ended the threat of an absolute monarchy in England, promised the population some rights, and banned Catholics from inheriting the throne. However, the new monarchs were faced with both war and rebellion. Louis XIV responded to the invasion by starting the 9 Years' War, a war which England would later be pulled into. Plus, James had held considerable support in Ireland and with some Highland clans, so these, the Jacobites, began to rebel against William's rule. The French helped James return to Ireland in March 1689, and there he gathered supporters to try and reclaim the throne. However, William was able to link up with the Protestant population of Ulster, the descendants of the Scottish and English lands.
Yeah, we can maybe cut out there, but okay, yeah, that's super interesting. So, yeah, so there's a mirroring coup in 1689 in New England, where and Simon Bradstreet, Anne Bradstreet's husband, plays a role in it. Also, the Mathers do, and basically they want to get the sort of soft on Catholic people out too, and Andros gets there's a tax revolt first that he fights off, and then he can't fight off the coup that there's like a mob basically, and people are freaking out, like accusing Andros of instead of going to fight the French and Native Americans in Maine, he's going to team up with them and come put down the Puritans. Which is it's like the jade helm of
I was about to say, they're like, you can see they're like early American seeds of being just sprouting ever so slightly in this moment.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's like fractal history. So let's go back to Frances Hill's Delusion of Satan, where she talks about the shadow of the Indian Wars and imperial wars, I guess.
The assumption that death comes at the end of a long life, except in rare instances, belongs to the 20th century. But epidemics that strike down huge numbers, especially of babies and children, are hard to bear even for those all too accustomed to the notion that life is precarious. The colonial charter, revoked in 1684, had not yet been restored. Without it, the colonists had no legal right to the lands that, for most of them, constituted the bulk of their wealth. The rumours reaching the colony from London about increased Mathers negotiations were far from encouraging, but the greatest fear was not epidemics or loss of wealth, but the Indians. It would be hard to exaggerate the terror inspired in the settlers by the Native Americans. Unsurprisingly, they had responded to the white people's cruelty, treachery, and injustice with merciless fury. When the English first arrived, the Indians had welcomed and aided them, but the English took their lands, broke treaties, and killed and enslaved them. They also, less culpably, infected them with smallpox and other diseases to which the native people had no immunity, cutting their numbers by 3/4 in less than 50 years. In 1675, the Indians' gathering rage and desperation broke forth in a countrywide attack. King Philip's War, so named because the Indian leader Metocomet was dubbed Philip by the English, lasted only 2 years, but was the bloodiest in American history. 1 in 10 settlers was killed. That figure represents more people dead per capita than in any other conflict in which Americans have taken part. 70 soldiers from Salem Village and adjacent towns died in one battle. Young women such as Mary Walcott and Mercy Lewis grew from infancy to childhood in that war's aftermath, and were exposed daily to the grief of its widows and orphans and the innumerable tales of its horrors. Of the 1676 massacre at Lancaster, only 40 miles from Salem Village, Mary Rowlandson wrote shortly afterward, "It is a solemn sight to see so many Christians lying in their blood, some here and some there, like a company of sheep torn by wolves, all of them stripped naked by a company of hellhounds, roaring, singing, ranting, and insulting as if they would have tore our very hearts out." The reciprocal hatred of the Puritans for the Indians is dramatically illustrated by an episode in 1677 in which a group of women emerging from church set upon 2 Indian prisoners from Maine and with their bare hands literally tore them apart. An eyewitness reported that "we found the Indians with their heads off and gone, and their flesh in a manner pulled from their bones." In 1692 there were signs that the Indians might be about to launch another full-scale offensive. King William's War, fought between the French and the English but with Indian support for the French, had started 3.5 years before. The Indians had already perpetrated those devastating raids in Maine, to which Mercy Lewis's parents had fallen victim. The most recent had happened that winter on January 25 in York. The homes of 300 or 400 people were burned, 80 people were captured, and 50 were killed. Inhabitants of Salem Village, living scattered as they did over a largely undefendable area, felt exceedingly vulnerable to an attack that might come at any time. The Salem villagers had written in 1667 in a petition to Salem Town, asking to be allowed not to send men to join the watch there. The distance of our houses, one from another, some a mile, some further, is such that it is difficult sending one neighbour to another in dark nights in a wilderness that is so little cleared and by ways unpassable. They showed the degree of their fear of the Indians when they added, "'Tis probable, if the French or Dutch should come, they will have a convoy of Indians from east or west, and come first upon remote dwellers. The consideration whereof is liable to strike terror into the hearts of women and weak ones, especially considering what dreadful examples former times hath afforded in that respect in this country from Indians, and from others also, in the night season, when their husbands have been absent."
The constant political arguments about the night watch and watch duty, and also military forces and how you project military power into the environment around you. You hear libertarians talk about property and who owns property and what the use of the state is. Mm-hmm. And you look back, and the point is, like, nobody would own shit if it wasn't for community action through state power.
Yeah.
Like, and that's what creates, like, even when, you know, socialists mention the fire department as an example of socialism.
The cops are socialism.
It's like, well, I mean, cops are, it's more obvious to people, but even the fire department, right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
The fire department basically exists, and this is a just so story, but I think it's accurate. Basically, so, like, the capitalist warehouse doesn't get burnt down. Like, that's why originally these things are created. Like, it's not for egalitarianism. It's not because everybody deserves. I mean, there's some of that, obviously. You know, good for Ben Franklin and his public spiritedness.
Well, I mean, the making firefighters go from private to public was because of the race riots during the Civil War in New York City for New Yorkers.
Wow.
So yeah, there's a direct correlation between worker uprisings going up to the Upper East Side and Upper West Side and killing people, and saying, like, well, we should maybe not have private firefighters anymore.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, and that's a big part, annoyance, for the Puritans at this point, is because of, you know, King Philip's War. And this is similar to a lot of the wars that preceded the American Revolution. Who's going to get taxed to pay for that war?
Yeah.
And that creates strife. So, you know, maybe the Iraq War wasn't such a free endeavor, and after all. But
well, I think what Mary Rowlandson outlined so well, and we cover it in much greater detail in the episode on that, but just how much of constant warfare it is to live in colonial America. That it's like almost like to be a colonist is to essentially subsume yourself into some form of PTSD.
Definitely, yeah. And that, I think that can't be stressed enough, especially when we talk about, you know, do they actually believe there are witches? What's going on with people?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of these people have seen horrifying things. Even the judges were, like, you know, colonels or whatever in the wars. It's seen a lot of shit.
And it's never over is the other thing. It's not like things don't wrap up in, like, neat packages where it's like, oh, that war is over, so that conflict is over. It's constant skirmishing.
Yeah.
Like, that's why they're afraid of forests, because they don't know, like, what enemy might be in there that's, like, about to scalp them and their family.
And because this is no longer Thanksgiving times. Like, this is beef now.
This is a nightmare.
The Native Americans realize that they're getting pushed more and more off their lands. They've made that discovery, like, by 1692, they've made that discovery by at least a quarter of a century. I mean, honestly, Pequot War, like, half a century.
Or mid-17th century, like, it's on at that point.
Exactly. And, man, it is crazy. Let's go a little bit more with Francis Hill.
Cotton Mather believed that the Indians were the wretched remnant of a race seduced to the Western Hemisphere by the devil so that he might rule undisturbed by Christians teaching the gospel. This view, of course, made them all the more terrifying. The fact that whole tribes had been converted to Christianity by the French made them seem not less sinister, but if anything more so. Catholicism was to the Puritans as abhorrent as devil worship. The Indians' menace was deepened still further by the fact that they appeared to exert a terrifying attraction over those in their power. Of all the New Englanders taken captive and offered the chance to go home again, between 25 and 71% elected to stay. That at least a quarter of captives should have preferred life with the Indians to their Puritan existence must have seemed threatening indeed.
It's called voting with your feet, folks. Yeah.
The power of purchasing power.
Let's talk about the Mathers a little bit.
Two weirdest names in American history, I've decided.
Well, Increase Mather.
That's his dad.
Who was a president of Harvard University. Grace's Harvard.
Oh, no, sorry. Increase Mather and Cotton Mather.
So, he's named Increase. And actually, I do not hate this naming convention and think we should come back to it.
Increase?
You know why he's called Increase?
No.
Did you pick that up? Because business was booming.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, the natural increase, you know, you plot out how many increase in cows am I going to have by 4 years? How many increase in corn or how many increase in livestock, basically.
I feel like I hate it more, though, now.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. It's so utilitarian.
Abundance Mather.
Literally, that's not a joke. There's probably somebody named Abundance.
Oh, yeah. I feel like that's like a pretty... like hope and abundance. I don't know.
Yeah. But I actually do like that, frankly.
Increase Mather. It's like a mnemonic device for that era, but it's literally his name.
It's like NBA players that change their names, like Meta World Peace or World Be Free.
Oh, yeah.
I assume World Be Free changed his name. So, yeah, I got some notes on good old Cotton Mather here. Born in Boston, 1663. So he was young when the trials were coming. In the 1680s, he's 1683 is hitting he's 21 when the charter's revoked. Publishing all sorts of stuff about like the role of women, stuff about the King Philip's War, a lot of like the state theocracy's line on things. He's basically the Sean Spicer for. No, I guess
that's doing him dirty.
Yeah, that's okay.
He's like
he's prolific author. Like he writes fucking books.
He's like the first prolific or like kind of like colonial person. He doesn't have any ties to England, but his parents are from there, but he has like their tradition in a way, but he's gotten rid of like the more specifics about like, you know, like separatist versus Puritan and things like that. Like he's definitely a creature of the Americas. But also like educated at this like higher level that was awarded to him via like Increase Mather. Yeah,
so he graduates Harvard in 1681 at the age of 15.
Yeah.
So like not like the Aaron Schwartz of his time.
Yeah, he actually finished school unlike Jeff Zuckerberg.
And we should note later in his life after he'd, you know, murdered or helped kill 19 people.
Yeah.
By, you know, I mean, he is responsible for a lot of this stuff. He helped promote inoculation, which is like that early sign of science creeping into it. Although you see, so like they tried to be scientific with the witch evidence here too, like with the touch test. And
yeah, it's the same process, just with really bad evidence. That's all.
Going down the wrong path. So his father, Increase, is a pastor at the North Square Church in Boston, also president of Harvard. Also another Ivy League connection. Cotton convinced Ella Yale to donate to what became Yale University. So these people are all over. The Puritans are all over this stuff. In 1689, he wrote Memorable Provinces. And in that, it talked about the Catholic washwoman Goody Glover, who was executed as a witch for afflicting the Goodwin family. And contemporary Robert Califf, who we might talk about later, big critic of Mather and the witch hysteria, criticized that book for leading to some of the witch hysteria. 1689, also Increase Mather, basically against spectral evidence, which means taking the accuser's word for it that a person's spirit visited them.
Yep.
He also wrote in 1684, an essay for the recording of illustrious providences, which is a compilation of stories showing the hand of divine providence in rescuing people from natural and supernatural disasters. So a little bit of witchcraft there. And then his son comes 5 years later with memorable providences relating to the witchcraft and possessions, a faithful account of many wonderful and surprising things that have befallen several bewitched and possessed persons in New England. Oh yeah, and let's go back on. This is from Storm of Witchcraft. Which, if I was going to recommend one book, I think the Boyer and Nissenbaum, which we'll get to in a second, is maybe a classic, but this is the most up to date 1-volume version by Emerson Baker, A Storm of Witchcraft: The Salem Trials and the American Experience. That's Oxford University Press. And here's the Mathers in the shadow of King Philip's War and talking about witches.
In this invisible world of spiritual conflict, the enemy remain hid all the while under some fair cloak, but they shall proceed until they be known. Satan and his minions had been unleashed by God to tempt Puritans into sin and degeneracy. Sermons such as Stoughton's painted a terrible picture of the horrible fate that awaited sinners and all of New England if they succumbed to temptation. In 1674, Increase Mather warned that the Lord should seem at this day to be numbering many of the rising generation for the sword, as if to say, I will bring a sword to avenge the quarrel of a neglected covenant. The next year, Mather's warning seemed proven uncannily accurate when King Philip's War broke out. The struggle between the native and English populations of New England was another symptom of the growing pains facing the region. Native Americans felt increasingly squeezed by the growing English population, which pushed further into their lands and threatened their traditional lifeways in the process. Fighting started in the summer of 1675 in southern New England and continued along the northern frontier until the spring of 1678. The war was one of the bloodiest and most destructive conflicts in American history. Thousands of Native Americans and hundreds of colonists were killed, injured, or displaced, and the fighting left much of the frontier zones of New England a blackened, smoldering ruin. The war broke native power in southern New England, with the majority of the population being killed, sold into slavery, or fleeing to northern New England or New York. The reverse held true in Maine, where the Wabanaki had destroyed most English settlements. With the Treaty of Casco, 1678, the English even agreed to pay annual tribute of a peck of corn per family to the local sachems in recognition of native sovereignty. Beyond the suffering, the war was extremely expensive. The English colonial administrator Edward Randolph estimated the English losses in houses and livestock at £150,000, and the colonies claimed it cost £100,000 to wage the war. This was at a time when the total wealth for an average English settler's estate might total £200 in real estate, livestock, and personal possessions. While these figures may be on the high side, the magnitude of the financial loss is indisputable, as is its impact on the colonies. Colonial treasuries would be depleted, and colonists would face high taxes for years to come. Although most of the fighting took place far away from Essex County, the war had a powerful effect on the region. Not even people in Salem Town felt safe. They went so far as to build a half-mile-long palisade across Salem Neck to defend against native attack. It cost more than £250 to build that palisade and strengthen other defenses for the town. They also prayed for the safe return of the hundreds of members of the Essex County militia who had gone off to fight. All right,
and let's move a little bit ahead in the Storm of Witchcraft for a bit more on the sort of knowledge of witches in the community in general, which was greatly, as we've already mentioned by the two books by the Mathers, engendered and helped out by the Mathers publicizing, hey, if you don't believe in witches, you're helping Satan, buddy.
Yeah. Yeah. That's like when, I think the modern equivalent of that is like when religious people, like primarily like evangelical Christians, are like, well, you know what? They just worship atheism, or they just like refer to atheism as a religion. So it's like, you already have a religion,
right?
But it should be us instead of nothing.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to go through all of the trouble of not being a Puritan, you're going to basically still go through all the fucking like meetings and masses, although it's just at nighttime instead of day, basically.
Yeah, you're going to get a lot of shit.
Yeah, and have to drink blood or, I guess, do some sign books with blood, which who wants to do that?
Do not do that.
Yeah. Yeah, whatever you do, don't bleed,
not sign the
don't
devil's
bleed
book.
onto paper, because the devil reads it then. Oh yeah, actually, here's a little bit more. This is in the post-mortem for, what we need to change about society after King Philip's War. And I think it's Cotton Mather has some interesting theories.
In King Philip's War and its terrible losses, Puritan ministers had their proof of spiritual decline and God's wrath. In 1679, the General Court called for a synod of clergy and lay leaders to look into the colony's evils and how to redress them. The greatest was a visible decay of godliness, profaneness, Sabbath-breaking, excessive pride, and covetousness of wealth.
Ooh.
The synod called for a program to support moral reformation of the entire colony. This would require legislative action, as well as hard work by ministers and their parishioners. The legislature responded by tightening up laws concerning taverns and focusing on education. There were renewed efforts to provide financial support to Harvard College, the training ground of Puritan ministers, and to require public education in communities with at least 500 souls. The Reforming Synod of 1679 was called for after the death of Governor John Leverett, who was replaced by Simon Bradstreet. Leverett, a political realist, had exerted a moderating influence on the strict religious...
Let's cut it there. I mean, it is funny how you go to education and prohibition, and people are drinking too much and they're not learning enough, and that's the problem. It's not how we're governing as like a political elite.
It's not a land issue by any means.
Yeah.
It reminds me when after 9/11, when Jerry Falwell went on TV and he goes, "Well, why this happened is because of the pagans in this country and feminism."
Yeah, and I mean, as witches, witches is sort of the marriage of those two things.
Yeah.
Here's some more war hysteria stuff.
Indeed, the symptoms of the afflicted in Salem seem to suggest direct knowledge of several recent outbreaks, including the Lowestoft case in England and the recent affliction of the Goodwin children of Boston. Accounts had been published of both of these cases. Deodat Lawson observed a grievous fit by Abigail Williams, who ran dangerously about the house, going near the fire, gathering firebrands and throwing them, sometimes making as if she would fly, stretching up her arms as high as she could and crying, "Wish, wish, wish," several times. Lawson was told that on other occasions Abigail would appear to try to run up the chimney, and had attempted to go into the fire. Martha Goodwin would have to be restrained as well, to keep her out of the fire. In the Lowestoft case, a bewitched girl ran round about the house holding her apron, crying, "Hush, hush." Like Abigail, she showed a strange fascination with fire. Abigail was not known to vomit pins, but she was stuck by them on multiple occasions. The Lowestoft outbreak occurred in 1662, but the account that included these details was not published until 1682, and then it rapidly became widely available. In 1688, Cotton Mather observed the Goodwin children in Boston, and the next year he published Memorable Providences, relating to witchcrafts and possessions, an account of their case. Here, too, the account suggests that the tormented pretended to fly. Yea, they would fly like geese, and be carried with an incredible swiftness through the air, having but just their toes now and then upon the ground, and their arms waved like the wings of a bird. The Lowestoft case was published in 1682, and Mather's account of the Goodwins was printed in 1689, though these would have been the latest and best-known cases of witchcraft, presumably known not only to ministers and doctors, but also to young girls, especially those who lived in a parsonage. Memorable Providences even included a description of witchcraft in Mora, Sweden. In the spring and summer of 1679, Mora had witnessed a huge witch hunt. Based largely on spectral evidence recounted by numerous children, 60 suspects were interrogated and 23 were burned at the stake. Such widespread participation of children, the quick spread of charges, and the use of spectral evidence all made the case seem quite unusual and extreme, though it bears uncanny similarities to the situation in Salem. As Norton has noted, consciously or unconsciously, the Salem Village afflicted had incorporated the previously recorded behaviors into their own repertoires. Even in 1692, some observers believed fraud was at work. Reverend Samuel Willard questioned the credibility of the afflicted, noting, "The common vogue, that they are scandalous persons, liars, and loose in their conversation, and therefore not to be believed." There was some courtroom evidence to support such a charge. A supporter of Elizabeth Proctor testified that he had heard one of the girls admit that she did it for sport. They must have some sport. The Nurse family made a well-organized campaign to discredit Rebecca's accusers. They produced depositions that questioned the veracity of both Mercy Lewis and Betty Hubbard. They pointed out that Susanna Sheldon contradicted herself in her testimony. And they gave her...
Yeah, so, I mean, now's probably a good time to talk about what we think was actually going on, and I assume neither of us think actual witchcraft and demonic possession.
No, yeah, I'll say probably not.
Yeah, I mean, 1% chance, maybe.
Yeah. We don't want to rule it out entirely.
Like what happened between Sarah Good and Noyes and the blood?
With the blood?
Drink?
That's a real thing.
It's a real thing. We'll end on that maybe. So a few things going on. So the first few girls, the Paris girls, I think, well, his niece and his daughter. And we'll get more into Samuel Paris in the Crucible episode. But they basically were crawling around and then were having these sorts of convulsion things. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fairly clear to me that, the theory of what's called conversion disorder, which seems to me to be like a sort of cousin of Tourette's syndrome.
Yeah.
Where and we'll play a little bit here. There's modern instances of this. The famous case in Leroy, New York, about 10 years ago in the wake of the financial crisis, that these tics develop. And in a Puritan context, especially when you have Samuel Paris talking about, he knows how many devils are in the church and who they are. That's like basically a paraphrase name of one of his sermons. That sort of thing, or even Tourette's syndrome, you can see how that's going to be instantly interpreted into a sort of, or not even instantly, over time interpreted into a sort of satanic context. And Boyer and Nissenbaum, who wrote Salem Possessed on the social origins of witchcraft, which we'll talk about in a bit, talk about how the difference between it's all down into the interpretation of the adults in that behavior. Mm-hmm. So they could interpret it as basically the exact same things, writhing, seeing images, as a awakening of sorts, as it was like in 1700s, 18th century, or it could be seen as like a witch paranoia or a demon attack. And that's what was happening in Salem because of how fractious the community was, basically.
Well, and I think those authors had outlined specifically an instance where the exact same circumstances had happened in 1734, under the tutelage of Jonathan Edwards, probably one of the more famous religious leaders in colonial history. And he saw the exact same signs, and he's like, these are visions coming from God. Yeah. And everyone's like, oh, great. And no one died.
Hell yeah, exactly. Nobody was hanged. Yeah. It was actually good for religion and not completely discrediting of theocracy.
Yeah.
So I think it's, especially when you think of Tourette's syndrome, imagine somebody having Tourette's back then and how fucked they had been.
Yeah.
And because there's no context for how you understand that. It seems satanic. Like, why are you swearing all the time, man? Why are you having these weird tics? And it's, and I don't know what's going on with, Tourette's syndrome, but with conversion disorder, it seems very, very clear that, and I mean, if you want to look at the videos, it's kind of, I mean, I'd be freaking out too if I was going through that with what those girls there's a bunch of girls at this high school in upstate New York that have these weird tics and they can't stop like either shouting or like grunting or moving their hands, and it sucks, and it's catchy apparently.
Yeah.
And it's pretty horrifying, but I think that's what I think it was going on, but also, and we'll talk about this in the Crucible episode as well, but the Putnam family does seem to be like fraudsters to me. Like they were
like, oh great, this is happening.
And I think there's actually a fine line between what's conscious fraud and what's, just hysteria. Like, we don't have the same evidentiary requirements, obviously. I mean, they were trying to set some, and this obviously, like, reinforced the need for evidentiary requirements. But, like a woman, for instance, there's a few books that focus on the sort of feminist side of this. Devil in the Shape of the Woman, by Caroline Carlson, and, Damned Woman by Elizabeth Reese. And what Reese especially points out is that women were more likely to say, like, did I make a pact with Satan? I mean, you're suggesting I did. maybe I did. This is, and I think this is an intersectional issue because this is especially the case with Tituba, who's like as a slave is basically learned over her life how to anticipate what her masters want.
Yeah.
And I think that's very obvious in the Haythorne questioning of her, and where she's the first sort of big confessor. Well,
there's a number of these scenarios. I mean, especially looking at it through a feminist lens, when these women are talking about how they need to find some source for where these fits are coming from because their husband is threatening to beat them to death. So all of a sudden, the scenario is not did they do it or did they not. It's if they admit to this, it's over. Because they're being if they have the fits, that means they're being cursed by someone else, and it means they probably won't be murdered by their husband. It's like a extremely traumatic position to be put in. It becomes very relatable to be like, yes, someone's putting a hex on me, probably, because I don't want to die.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a few different kinds of witchcraft, and we already talked, like, it was pervading the culture a little bit, and then you also had folk magic, so the horseshoe above the door, that's thought of as counter magic or white magic, but still magic, and people like Samuel Parris would not have looked kindly upon it.
No.
And you also have image magic, which is the sort of voodoo doll type of thing, or poppets as they were known in New England. And maleficium. The interesting thing about a lot of these accusations is it's like, you made my cow get sick, or something's going on with my chickens because of this woman it
hasn't rained in the last 30 days.
And the other connection scholars have made is that, like, witches, especially in the European context, are people who were turned down favors by the people they're accused by.
Yeah,
so,
weird.
like, I ask Alex for a Coke.
Yep.
And he says no, and then later, like, basically he feels guilty about something, and that guilt has him accuse me of being a witch.
Yeah.
And I'm not one. So yeah, that's a little roundup of witchcraft there. You also have falling church attendance going on, especially in Salem Village, and witches were like something you would display publicly. It's like a fun thing, or not a fun thing to look at, but it reminds you of how important religion is.
Well, it's a binding agent. It's like the classic, like, other, like we're the in group, they're the out group. Mm-hmm. It's like, and like defining the out group, like if you read like what's Edward Said's like masterpiece on Orientalism, like the best way to solidify the in group is to identify the out group. So for these, like, it's no coincidence that like this Puritan movement is kind of losing a little bit of steam, and to be like, well, you know what, we're completely overrun by the devil right now. To give it like that last bit of juice, like that Nas juice, to keep the project moving.
Yeah. And I mean, so much so that in the height of the trials, the witches, or the accusers, were being driven by a horse and a man per woman. Yeah. Which is like, that's like the Hummer limo of the 17th century.
Yeah.
With a pool in the back. Like, that's rolling in high class. If you have all these girls, they upend basically the power structure of society. It's young adolescent women, largely, although there were some middle-aged or older ones, but largely that are deciding all of this stuff because they were given power by the lunatics. They're the Puritan elite. The Puritan elite, increase in Cotton Mather, the theology side of it was very strong. You have Governor Simon Bradstreet, who Anne is dead for about 20 years at this point.
Yep.
And he remarried. But he's governor when the trials break out, but he's old as hell. And so he puts Stoughton in charge. And the funny thing about, so a lot of the people, Sewell, Danforth, a lot of the judges that were put on this sort of emergency court of oyer interminer, they'd all seen witchcraft cases before, so it wasn't like this came out of nowhere for them, and they'd actually handled them better than this by, they didn't hang people.
Yeah.
But what I think this is in Storm of Witchcraft, it talks about how there was a piracy case and some people got arrested for piracy, but they had a lot of connections with the elite and they basically were let off scot-free.
Yep.
Which is like, it shows you the connection between the organized crime and the state isn't quite as wide as it ought to be.
Yeah.
And it may be made to look that way for appearance's sake. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about the distinction between Salem Town and Salem Village.
Right.
Salem Town is, it's as you would expect. It's the port town. Salem Village is a village that sprouts up later, basically because farms are needed to feed people in Salem Town. And eventually they're like, we own our own stuff. Salem Town is not so hospitable to that because they've already had a few cities branch off. And they're like, no, we want Salem. Also, you're called Salem Village. I mean, we're both Salem, so let's keep things together there. The best take on this, I think, comes from Boyer and Nissenbaum. Their classic, The Social Origins of Witchcraft. This came out.
It's like the mid-'70s, I think.
Yeah, 1974. And it's referenced by everything now, basically. And
so I think Storm of Witchcraft essentially just had like half a chapter that was a recap of their findings.
Yeah, and Delusion of Satan also has an extended period where it just summarizes this work. So first, discussion on the economics of Salem.
By the 1690s, Salem Town was a far cry from the community it had been half a century earlier, when the first farmers had left it for the hinterland settlement which would become Salem Village. Prosperous from the start, the town in the years after 1660 entered its great era of economic and specifically mercantile expansion. Well before the end of the century, that expansion had led, as one recent study puts it, to a distinctly urban pattern of life in Salem Town. The town's growing commercial importance was officially recognized in 1683 when the General Court designated Boston and Salem as the colony's two ports of entry through which all imports and exports had to pass. Increasingly, Salem was gaining access to a broader trading orbit of which London was the center. Such evidence as the close correspondence during these years between grain prices in Salem and in London indicates that the Atlantic market was becoming a reality, and the merchants of Salem Town were immersed in it, exporting cod and mackerel, furs, horses, grain, beef, pork, masts, and naval stores to the other American colonies, the West Indies, the Canaries, Newfoundland, and England, and importing tobacco, sugar, cloth, rum, and a host of other products. In the 1690s, 26 Salem men owned 21 merchant vessels, averaging nearly 50 tons each and comprising 12% of the total tonnage in Massachusetts. While this left Salem far behind dominant Boston, it did make her, as the 1683 legislation had recognized, the only other really significant mercantile center in the colony. One consequence of these developments was a sharp rise in the town's relative wealth. In the first 30 years of its settlement, the period before 1660, the average size of individual Salem Town estates recorded in probate court had actually been lower than the average for the rest of Essex County. In contrast, during the period 1661 through 81, the estates of Salem Town dwellers averaged almost one-third higher than those from the rest of the county. But Salem's rising prosperity and cosmopolitan connections did not benefit equally all segments of the town population. Quite the contrary. In the 1661 through 81 period, again on the evidence of probated wills, the richest 10% of Salem's population controlled 62% of its wealth, almost 3 times as much as it had controlled a generation earlier. What had happened, in fact, was
weird. So the capitalist elite seemed to be accruing more and more of the wealth of the country.
That is weird.
Spooky.
That's definitely a unique. It's spooky. Yeah, it's perfect for the times because it's hard to even imagine that now.
It's weird. What must be some sort of witchcraft that's making capitalism inefficient? And,
Definitely a one-off.
Serve the few people who own capital. It's very spooky.
the richest 10% of Salem's population controlled 62% of its wealth, almost 3 times as much as it had controlled a generation earlier. What had happened, in fact, was that the prosperity of the town had polarized the distribution of its wealth and propelled into a position of clear dominance a single group of men, the merchants. The rise of the merchant class was reflected in Salem Town politics. In the years before 1665, twice as many farmers as merchants had been elected town selectmen. In the 1665 through 1700 period, the merchants among the selectmen outnumbered the farmers by 6 to 1. Only those few farmers with close merchant ties and affinities, like the Porter family, which we shall examine in the next chapter, continued to exercise any sustained political influence in the town.
So let's talk about the class breakdown of this a little bit. The interesting thing, to reduce it drastically, what you have going on is a mercantile capitalist elite overwhelming a Puritan, theocratic, and agricultural elite. The Salem Witch Trials and the people who are basically accusing the side generally that's accusing people of being witches is from that agricultural, the Salem Village. And the people that are closer to Salem, the closer to Salem Town you are, the more likely you are to be accused of being a witch or a wizard. And so we'll play, actually, I got another clip here that will set this up a little bit more.
As early as 1689, in his memorable providences relating to witchcrafts and possessions, Cotton Mather had urged his readers to shun a frame of discontent if they wished to avoid becoming witches. When persons, through discontent at their poverty or at their misery, shall be always murmuring and repining at the providence of God, the devils do then invite them to an agreement, and downright witchcraft is the upshot of it. From the perspective of those who led the attack in 1692, such an analysis might have seemed to explain not only disruptive malcontents at the lower end of the scale, people like Job Tukey and Sarah Good, but also prospering and upwardly mobile people like John Proctor, John Willard, and Rebecca Nurse. There were, after all, various ways to betray discontent with one's natural station. One could turn embittered and spiteful, to be sure. But on the other hand, like the young Proctor and Nurse, one might combine aggressive behavior with good fortune and improve one's status. From a 17th century viewpoint, swift economic rise was just as tangible an expression of discontent as was muttering or complaining. Everybody knew that by 1692, John Proctor was wealthier than any of his accusers, yet they also knew that he remained Goodman Proctor, while Thomas Putnam, by virtue of his father's station, bore the more honorific designation Mr. Putnam. As Abigail Williams cried out during a spectral visitation in mid-April, running down a list of newly accused witches, "Oh, yonder is Goodman Proctor and his wife, and Goody Nurse, and Goody Cory, and Goody Cloyce." Abigail's own uncle may not have been receiving his salary at the time, but he was nevertheless Mr. Paris, and at the witchcraft examination of Mary Clark of Haverhill, young Ann Putnam commented sarcastically that even though the accused woman was now addressed as Mistress Mary Clark, Ann well knew that people used to call her Goody Clark. All of these people were on the move socially and economically. Yet to many New Englanders of the 17th century, the stability of the social order rested on the willingness of everyone to accept his given station in life. Refusal to do so was more than a personal weakness. It represented a tangible threat to the social fabric itself. When Cotton Mather preached a sermon in 1689 in response to a Boston witchcraft case of that year, he chose a biblical text which made this very point. Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft.
This is awesome.
The rebellion Mather had in mind here was surely not the political sort, not in the very year that he had supported the successful overthrow of Governor Andros, but the even more menacing variety implicit in both the spiteful turbulence of those who were sliding down the social ladder and the pushy restlessness of those who were climbing up. The feeling that Mather articulated in this 1689 sermon was one shared by many people in Salem Village 3 years later. The social order was being profoundly shaken by a superhuman force which had lured all too many into active complicity with it. We have chosen to construe this force as emergent mercantile capitalism. Mather and Salem Village called it witchcraft.
Yeah, so I think that's a pretty... I mean, it might be a little bit reductive, but I think a very interesting summary on the material outside of this.
Yeah, I think it's a very excellent lens to read it through. I mean, it's such a bizarre scenario that there are many different ways you can trace this, or you can look at it through many different lenses. But I think looking at it like it's an inflection point, like a rising power and a falling power, and they meet each other in the middle, and it's going to be violent for the most part, is something we're going to see again and again in American history, and it manifests in like the culture that's present at the time. And
this is such a huge cultural break because, I mean, we've talked about it, Hobbamock, Hope Leslie, Mary Rowlandson, like the Puritan theocratic culture was dominant.
Yeah.
And then this is a huge discrediting of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and this is it for them also. Like they're done, like as a political and social force, the Puritan movement is done on the English continent. It's done in the European mainland. Like it has this one kind of last outcrop in America. And even their own children are like, I don't know. And then this is just such a like like an accelerationist force is really the only way to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too much into the actual 1692 business of it, but it's worth touching on a few of the figures who aren't really got into in the Crucible, and like this period of history and this whole witch affair. It makes me sick to my stomach. Like you hear about the actual individuals involved in this. And I might be looking ahead to the next episode a little bit, but I do want to mention Martha Corey, Giles Corey's wife, and we'll talk about this specifically. But the way she first like tries to logic game her way out of this, like, oh, did the girls tell you exactly what clothes I'm wearing? And then the Puritan like magistrates, I can't remember who's questioning her, maybe Hawthorne, maybe someone else, or maybe Corwin. Says, how did you know we were gonna ask that?
Yeah.
And then the most heartbreaking thing for me is she's like, Hawthorne asks her, how can you laugh at them, or how can you laugh at this? And she says, I can't help it, and they're all against me. And it's clear that her laughter in that courtroom is nervous laughter.
Yeah. As
she sees these girls perform these hysterics on cue, like to try to, present her as a witch. And, what do you do? And she says she can't help laughing. Like that she's laughing and she can't help it.
Yeah.
As she's in the view of that court, basically sentencing herself to death.
Well, it's such a damning display of what that like the authors of Salem Possessed really are quite poignant on this, where they say like that the fact that the way that the culture had been set up, where you're enticed to lie that someone else had performed a spell on you, rather than saying I'm not a witch. Like saying I'm not a witch is the most dangerous thing you could do,
right?
And lying and saying someone else is the best thing you could do to save your own life. Yeah. Showed that it was doomed to failure. Like this is the ultimate terminus point. Like not all colonies or towns in the colonies are going to get up at this point. And this is the most famous one, obviously, but this kind of setup was going to happen. This kind of like disaster tragedy, basically.
Yeah. I mean, it happened on both sides of the Atlantic, as we found out.
Yeah.
And another person I want to talk about, because I don't think he's in the Crucible, although I need to reread it. Maybe he is, but I think this is glossed over. George Burrough, who was the minister a couple times in the 1680s and always had payment disputes. Then he went and effed off for a while, but he got accused years later, and during like 5 to 7 years after he... Actually, I got some notes on him. So yeah, George Burrough, maybe the most famous person put to death. Born in Maryland or Virginia when his father was in the U.S. on business from the U.K. He graduated Harvard University, 1670. In 1676, he's in the Casco, Maine settlement he's in. It's broken up by an Indian assault. Burroughs escapes, moved to Salem in 1680, where he ministered for 2 years, and then, had a salary dispute. Had beef with John Putnam, who's the uncle to Thomas, who's one of the main villains we'll find out about in the next episode. And left Maine again in 1683, driven out by Indians again. So he went up to Maine after he left Salem and then came back, where he moved to Wells, Massachusetts, preached for 9 years, and then he was hauled to Salem from Wells, Massachusetts on May 4th, 1692. And Mather said he was promised to be above a witch, a conjurer. So they had the classifications out there. According to testimony. There's also testimony that he may have abused his wives. There's no hard evidence on there like there is for some of the people that were accused. Mm-hmm. But that's another underlying element, maybe a submerged one, that like a lot of these men, like Giles Corey, for instance, beat a hired hand to death. And Giles Corey seems like a hero. He's the one who rejected the court's authority and so they put rocks on him, which was the old.
His famous last words were "more weight."
Yeah, but he beat his hired hand possibly to death.
Yep.
And he possibly beat his wife too. And Proctor, we know Proctor beat Mary Warren, one of the accusers, his servant girl. That's in the Crucible. And he said he'd beat John Indian too. So like these are violent men, and there's almost like the Dixie Chicks by Earl song where they like get revenge on a.
Yes.
I wonder if there's an element of that going on in some of these cases too. But nonetheless, let's say George Burroughs didn't abuse his wife, because there's all their testimony that he was a good guy, and like I said, there's evidence of other people that there was. So if we did, we might have it. But anyway, Burroughs, he's also the men when they're accusing him of being a witch keep talking about how strong he is. So he can lift up a fucking rifle with one hand.
That's not just him. Also, you hear that in like a number of like men who are accused of witchcraft in the Americas, is that they can lift a musket with one finger.
Right.
It's just like it's the thing that's always present. That's heavy.
And Burroughs is like, well, there was an Indian there that could do it too, and that was the wrong thing to say, because Mather interprets that as, he means the devil.
Yeah, and is this Indian's name Satan?
Yeah, exactly. And then Burroughs also was apparently able to lift a giant maple barrel, and so he's just a big, strong guy, and that's a sign of being a witch. And a whole barrel of molasses, and everyone's like, that Indian knew the devil. So
I've heard enough. Kill him.
And so Increase Mather was at the trial for Burroughs. And after the witch trials were sort of over and there's some damage control spin being done by the Mathers, he did confirm that, like, I would have said he was guilty too. I would have hung him. He's definitely a witch. And the problem was when Burroughs was hung on... do I have that date? August 19th, despite a petition and his reputation, he perfectly recited the Lord's Prayer.
Which you cannot do if you're possessed or a witch.
Yeah, and the younger Mather, Cotton, was apparently there. And he said, disregard what he just did, everybody. Don't have any second thoughts. We're still going to hang him because we don't use this type of nonsense, superstitious test. And also, remember when we did the touch test on him? He failed that. And the touch test means, like, if I accuse Alex of being a witch, I'm going to be freaking out until the court makes Alex touch me. And once he touches me, my freak out magically disappears. And that's one of the way the accusers bullshitted about,
It's like the DNA of 17th century.
Yeah, it was based on Cartesian philosophy.
Yeah,
they thought so. It's perfect science. That if their fits stop when the person touches them, I mean, it's
open and shut. I don't know what other evidence you could possibly use.
Yeah. So Mather's like, hang him still, and he gets hung. So I mean, a very interesting little case study there. Especially the perfect recitation. I often like to emphasize. I want it to be a rhetoric professor when I was an undergrad.
Oh, really?
And then you come to find it how rhetoric is basically just a mask, and it might be interesting to study as that, but it doesn't really. Power and position is much more important.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter that George Burroughs perfectly recited this. He's still going to get killed because we can't let him challenge the Puritan state like that.
Yeah, the track's already laid.
Oh, to double back of other theories of what's going on, a lot of people mention waking up in the middle of the night and having a figure of one of the witches on their stomach.
Yeah.
What's very clearly going on there is the same thing that's going on when people say they wake up and aliens are on top of them in their room.
Yeah.
Or the incubus and succubus. It's sleep paralysis, which is what happens when you often sleep on your back. That happens to me when I sleep on my back. I'd say once a month maybe. I sleep on my back all the time now.
It affects about 10% of the population.
Yeah.
So it's pretty common.
Yeah, I'd imagine a lot of people listening to this have had this experience. Me, I've had it a few times. One more very vividly when I was living in Fargo. I woke up I'd been sleeping maybe an hour or so. I woke up, could not move, and I'd heard about sleep paralysis before, and I think this has happened to me before, but this is the first time it happened to me since I was consciousness of what was going on, hypnagogic sleep disorder. Mm-hmm. And I look into the corner of the room where the curtains are, and the curtains had morphed into a giant man who went from floor to ceiling. And his head was like a very amorphous thing I couldn't really see, but there's a lot of movement there. I struggled to move. I couldn't for a while, and then finally I busted out of it and moved, and then I looked in my room, and it's just the curtains. But what's happening there is the part of your brain that kicks in during sleep to make you not act out your dreams, like run away from a bear or something, mm-hmm. Is still active even though you're semi-alert and awake. And that part that causes you from moving also causes you to have these hallucinatory dreams. And you can project that onto the real world. And it's very clear that, once that's another thing like Tourette's is how you interpret that in the context of a Puritan world that thinks the world's coming to an end. Because you have all these Indian wars, you have this mercantilism that you don't understand. You're going to interpret that darkly.
Especially in a Puritan social context where it's hard to, I mean, we kind of understand that today, but try to imagine that everyone's personal problem is the community's problem. Mm-hmm. And it has cosmic implications too. And like in some ways they were quite what we would like consider advanced, like for like child abuse, for example. If you were caught abusing your child in the Puritan society, your child was taken away from you. And they became like a ward of the small community, and that's it. But it's the same thing where it's like if Terrence or if Matt or whoever had a nightmare yesterday a mile away and he saw the devil, like that's a big fucking problem for all of us. Yeah. And that's something that's like, that's not like, well, maybe it was weird. Like that's something that we need to deal with in court right away. Yeah,
because witchcraft became a criminal.
Yeah, so he basically has committed a crime.
Yeah, there's a crime that's happened here. Yeah. Oh man. Let's see, where should we move to now? I think now we can move to the part that I was most interested to learn about, which is very well covered in an excellent chapter that we're going to really pull from in this next final portion, in Emerson Baker's "The Storm of Witchcraft," about the cover-up. Because as we talked about earlier, Massachusetts lost its charter in 1684, and Increase Mather and Phipps. Was Cotton Mather over there too?
Yes.
Were over there negotiating for a new charter. They finally get it, and they come back, and all this witchcraft shit is going on. And
extremely bad timing.
On our worst behavior, as Drake would say. And so they're like, "Oh shit, we've just killed 19 people off the end of a rope
in a town of 600."
Yeah, and some of the most and well-respected people too. It wasn't just like the first few people were beggars. Tituba was a slave. She wasn't killed because she was too useful as as an informant. Oh, and arrested so many, like hundreds.
Yeah.
And the thing about being arrested is you're charged for that. That's not on the state's dime.
Yeah.
So there's going to be fees, and until you can pay those fees, you're not going to let out. For instance, Samuel Paris wouldn't pay Tituba's fees at the end of the thing. But the conditions are just horrible. There's like 3 different prisons, but they're, just filth and muck, like hell on earth.
Well, at least a couple women died in prison. I think the first death was someone who died in prison, right?
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah. And also a 4-year-old, Dorcas Good, who is Sarah Good's daughter, is arrested and kept there for like over a year.
Yeah.
Like fucking ice level, like bullshit.
Well, yeah, that definitely did remind me of when
Absolutely.
ICE puts those 4 or 5-year-olds on trial.
100% the witchcraft paranoia is mappable onto fear of so-called illegal immigrants.
Well, I mean, that's, to me, you don't always want to just be like, this is interesting because it maps onto today. But if you're talking about a group that is paranoid about losing power,
Yep.
and then lashes out at what they perceive as like the elites by going after people who they think are near the elites,
Mm-hmm.
like it's the same story, only on a much, much larger scale.
Yep.
Because I don't know how many people have died in ICE custody now. I think somewhere like 30 or something.
Well, I don't think we're given good information.
Yeah, we
on
don't
it.
know anymore. But there's this. Let me see if I can get it really quick. There's this author, Roberto Calesso, who's just written this book called The Unnameable Present. And there's this line I was reading while I was reading this stuff that really spoke to me, which is, there are some forms that don't die out, they change. They become filled and emptied of meaning according to the circumstances. But one subtle thread always binds them to their origin. And that's a really great way to look at history when you see events and it's like the circumstances are different and maybe the scale is different, but there's some germ that manages to survive and mutates and to fit its surroundings.
Yeah. Damn. I like that a lot. Because it is like forms and archetypes almost.
Yeah.
I mean, even the fear of possession by Satan parallels the captivity narratives that we're talking about with the Native Americans earlier. That the most popular, scenarios, and signing the Devil's Black Book is maps directly onto, at the time, signing deeds to lands and things like that.
Yeah, I think I think it's a storm of witchcraft that brings it up, that a lot of the visions that they're getting of the devil uniquely coincidentally can map onto property exchanges that have been going on throughout the colonial world.
All right, so now we're going to move back to Emerson Baker. He'll bring us home. We'll get the first cover-up of significance in American history that was intended to preserve the theocracy of the Puritans, but ultimately discredited them.
You can definitely see why Hawthorne is so obsessed with this period, besides being intimately related, because it falls right into his theory of... Oh, sorry.
You're good.
It falls right into his theory of no progress is possible. Like every time that people try to advance progress, the opposite occurs.
Yeah. Well, I will say, I don't want to get into it too much, but his dad his ancestor here is a fucking major asshole.
Yeah, really nasty.
Like, one of the worst.
Nasty guy.
His questioning, he's the sort of lead questioner, especially initially. Things like, a woman would say like, I know I'm not a witch, and I don't even know what witches are. And Mather's like, how do you know you're not Haythorne, how do you know you're not a witch if you don't know what witches are?
Yeah.
Like that sort of shit.
Yeah. It's a lot of it's a lot of like, I can't think
it's leading, is it leading questions like, when's the last time you hit your wife? He's like, which devil are you working for?
Yeah. When did you stop working for the devil?
Yeah. And, oh my God.
Literary fun fact also for Haythorne is that someone who helped round up witches to go before Haythorne was a guy named Ezekiel Cheever, who is, if you know John Cheever, that's his ancestor.
Oh, wow.
So they were in the same room multiple times. One of the greatest writers of the 19th century, the ancestor of the greatest writer of the 19th century, the ancestor of the greatest writer of the 20th century, were in the same room condemning and killing women. So good to think about. Both Harvard grads also.
Yeah, Harvard. I mean, that explains it. Mystery solved. How is this coincidence? Oh, they both went to Harvard.
Yeah.
Right.
On October 12, 1692, Governor Sir William Phipps wrote to William Blathwayt, the clerk of the Privy Council, to inform him of the witchcraft crisis. Phipps deflected blame for the affair, misleadingly claiming that he had missed most of the trials, for he was almost the whole time of the proceeding abroad, building forts and trying to win the war in Maine.
Doing man shit.
He had left the colony and the trials in the hands of Deputy Governor Stoughton and depended upon the judgment of the court as to a right method of proceeding in cases of witchcraft. What he came home to find, however, was many persons in a strange ferment of dissatisfaction, and some people in jail who were doubtless innocent and to my certain knowledge of good reputation. He was therefore going to stop further arrests and, to calm things down, ban any publications on the matter.
We should point out that one of those people he knows is a good person despite being accused is his wife. So it's like, you can accuse all your local... And powerful people were accused, although, you know, the more powerful you were, the more likely you were to like not be the one accused. But you know, Bradstreet's you know, relatives of Anne Bradstreet's brother-in-law, not from the same mother, but was significantly younger than him, was accused. He had to flee, I believe. Like it wasn't just, and obviously I think generally witch trials were about, you know, the beggar woman nearby.
Yeah.
But yeah, Phipps is like, excuse me, like, no, I think you're mistaken. And actually, even the questioners were like, you're mistaken. You're going to leave the courtroom now and think about that a little bit.
It was a real Rubicon moment when a Puritan minister was accused. I forget.
Was it Burroughs?
Burroughs, right?
Yeah.
Because without getting into too much detail, but like Paris was like, oh no, he's probably a witch too, which I think was really responsible for like, yeah, this could get this is completely out of control.
Yeah,
because there's all these like in their own culture, these like stopgaps where it's like, well, we can't go any further than this,
right?
And they kept throwing them up, being like, no, like they're like the call is coming from in the house. Well, like evil is everywhere. Another earlier Rubicon is Rebecca Nurse, who was a member of the church. Yeah. And it's like, if a member of the church, and that's another thing about, you know, Paris, and I don't want to, you know, talk about too much, but let's just touch on a little bit. Paris basically goes through this accelerated understand. It comes to an accelerated understanding of the place of the Puritan church and the end of Puritan purity, basically. Yeah. So like you go from this thing of like, we're going to change the world into this, you know, Puritan vision to, we have sanctuary within our church from the devils outside. Mm-hmm. And then finally it's like, fuck, some devils are going to get in, devils
guys.
Are in here
like,
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, Phipps is like, my wife is accused. We're done with this. And also, nobody can write about this. And then he commissions Cotton Mather to do the spin for it, basically.
2 months later, on October 8th, Thomas Brattle wrote his letter, which was addressed to an unnamed Reverend Sir, but which was intended to be circulated publicly,
sir?
Containing a comprehensive assault on the witch trials, done in the scholarly and scientific manner befitting a Harvard graduate who had worked with Robert Boyle.
Harvard.
Like his contemporaries, Brattle believed in the existence of the devil and witches, but questioned the use of spectral evidence and the touch test. An observer of some of the trials, he was convinced that evil spirits deluded the confessing witches, and he noted that the confessors often contradicted themselves. Brattle pointed out the special treatment of some of the accused. Why did the court not pursue fugitives such as the Englishes and John Alden, he wondered. Why was Hezekiah Usher allowed to be under house arrest and then allowed to flee? If he may be suffered to go away, why may not others? If others may not be suffered to go, how in justice can he be allowed herein? While noting that there was still some support for the trials, Brattle documented the growing unrest in Massachusetts with the proceedings.
And this is a quote.
The Honorable Simon Bradstreet, Esquire, our late governor, the Honorable Thomas Danforth, Esquire, our late deputy governor, the Reverend Mr. Increase Mather, and the Reverend Mr. Samuel Willard, Major N. Saltonstall, Esquire, who was one of the judges, has left the court and is very much dissatisfied with the proceedings of it. Excepting Mr. Hale, Mr. Noyes, and Mr. Paris, the reverend elders, almost throughout the whole country, are very much dissatisfied. Several of the late justices, viz. Thomas Graves, Esquire, N. Byfield, Esquire, Francis Foxcroft, Esquire, are much dissatisfied. Also several of the present justices, and in particular some of the Boston justices, were resolved rather to throw up their commissions than be active in disturbing the liberty of their Majesties' subjects merely on the accusations of these afflicted, possessed children.
Yeah, and it's
Amid
true.
this growing clamor for the
Judge Saltonstall resigned after the first hanging of Bridget Bishop, and he wasn't happy with how it went.
trials to end and questioning their methods, only Cotton Mather's The Wonders of the Invisible World defended the actions of the government. The book was written quickly and rushed into print to try to buttress the government by endorsing the actions of the judges. Though some of the judges' methods might be disputed, the younger Mather insisted, there was still clear precedent for their actions. To prove this point, he discussed at length the influential writings of Gall and other English witchcraft experts. He also cited recent precedent for executions by discussing two relatively recent outbreaks in Europe. In 1662, the Bury St. Edmunds trials resulted in the conviction and execution of two elderly widows from Lowestoft, Suffolk, on 13 counts of witchcraft. In these trials, spectral evidence had been accepted by no less an authority than the eminent judge and Chief Justice of the King's Bench, Sir Matthew Hale. Mather also cited the trials in Mora, Sweden, in 1669 to 1670, which bore a strong resemblance to those in Salem. The younger Mather wrote the book at the request of Governor Phipps, so he had the active support of the judges and worked with court clerk Stephen Sewell to get access to all the trial transcripts. Yet his book focuses on just 5 of the 19 executed. Officials insisted that he include George Burroughs, to which Cotton added Bridget Bishop, Martha Carrier, Elizabeth Howe, and Susanna Martin. Mather chose these cases with great care, and as part of an effort to defend the use of spectral evidence. All had been accused of maleficium, harmful witchcraft, by numerous people, and all but Martin had been accused by confessed witches. Not only were these executions among the least controversial, but they relied far less on spectral evidence than other Salem trials. Thus Mather minimized the impact of spectral evidence. He was also selective even in his discussion of these cases. For example, he failed to mention Elizabeth Howe's supporters, including Deborah Hadley, who had known Elizabeth for 24 years and found her a neighborly woman, conscientious in her dealing, faithful to her missus, and Christian-like in her conversation. And of course Mather did not mention at all the more controversial cases, such as Rebecca Nurse's. At the time, the 29-year-old Cotton Mather was at the peak of his career, one that had started out with incredible promise. He graduated at 15 from Harvard, the youngest in its history, and was a brilliant intellect who would eventually master 7 languages. At 18 he received his master's and became the assistant pastor at his father's North Church. In 1685, at 22, he was ordained as minister of North Church, sharing duties with his father, who now officially moved to the position of teacher. As partner and intellectual heir of his father, Cotton had already published widely and was poised to be the next great Puritan theologian. Yet with its selective use of the evidence, The Wonders of the Invisible World severely damaged the reputation of one of the last standard-bearers of American Puritanism, and with him the cause itself. Why, then, did Cotton Mather write his book? And, in particular, why did he defend the use of spectral evidence, when earlier he had urged caution in its use, such as when writing to John Richards and composing for all the judges The Return of Several Ministers Consulted? The answer is that the witchcraft outbreak had blossomed into a political crisis, and Governor Phipps, as well as Deputy Governor Stoughton and the rest of the witchcraft judges, who were all also members of the Governor's Council, needed Cotton to carry out spin control. Despite his earlier efforts at moderation, the younger Mather was now willing to compromise his beliefs because he had become convinced that the fate of Puritan colony itself was at stake. Mather's gloss was needed to protect the fragile administration of Phipps, a close political ally of the Mathers and a member of their church. Phipps and Increase Mather had arrived in Boston from London only the previous May to commence the government under Massachusetts' new royal charter of 1691. No one knew what might happen if Phipps's government failed. Perhaps Andros or some other military governor might return, again threatening the liberties of the colony and its Puritan church. With Massachusetts beset with internal political division and locked in a desperate military struggle with the French and their native allies, a public acknowledgment that the judicial system had wrongly executed 19 people, pressed to death another, and imprisoned well over 100 more, would have brought down the new government and threatened the existence of the city upon a hill. Cotton acknowledged in Wonders, "I have indeed set myself to countermine the whole plot of the devil against New England, in every branch of it, and he believed that the witchcraft outbreak was part of a process that might bring the Puritan experiment to an end. Regardless, Governor Phipps had what he needed to defend the witch trials and bring the court of Oyer and Terminer to an end. With The Wonders of the Invisible World now published, he could call for a ban on future publications and squelch any further questioning of the judges or the government. A copy of the book traveled to London on the same ship that carried Phipps's letter to Blathwaite about the ban. To avoid any confusion about its status in regard to the prohibition, the reverse of the title page of Wonders announced that it had been published by the special command of His Excellency the Governor of the Province of the Massachusetts Bay in New England.
And thus the relationship between power and authorship is illustrated very clearly about, the truthfulness and the social responsibility of that work.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you can tell he wanted to tell the truth, but so much was at stake. The state itself was at stake, which, and not the women, they weren't at stake, but...
Yeah, not, their necks of innocent people. Good thing there's no more lying. For self and state preservation going on now. Here's a bit more. A few more clips here.
Stoughton, so that he could focus his efforts on the military crisis and the challenge of passing a new legal code through as soft on witchcraft. Nor did he want to be particularly close to it. He was happy to turn the proceedings over to Deputy Governor Stoughton so that he could focus his efforts on the military crisis and the challenge of passing a new legal code through a legislature that was increasingly divided. Despite spending 5 or 6 weeks in Maine leading the war effort in the late summer and fall, Phipps was present in Boston during all of the meetings of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, except for its September session. He could have played a much more active role in the proceedings had he wanted to, but he even turned over the authority to sign the death warrants to Stoughton. Not only did Phipps avoid the proceedings, but when he first reported the witchcraft outbreak to the Crown, he dissembled about his whereabouts, suggesting he had been off in Maine and shocked upon his return to find what a poor job Stoughton had done in his absence. By lying to his superiors in London, and by commissioning Cotton Mather's whitewash of the affair and then immediately imposing a publications ban, Phipps was following public opinion. While even educated people still believed that witches were real, most were becoming increasingly convinced that some innocent people had died. This was greater than a moral outrage. It was a doctrinal corruption. According to Puritan theology, someone who commits a sin must confess it before God. The state's sin should have been acknowledged publicly. Failure to do so jeopardized the Puritans' special covenant with God, and indeed the very foundation of their belief. It was an open invitation to bring down God's wrath on individuals and the entire colony. Yet admitting to the commission of sin would lead to equally dire consequences. If the state acknowledged the wrongful death or imprisonment of more than 150 innocent citizens, the new government would lose all authority. The king would be forced to recall Governor Phipps. The charter could be lost.
All right, and so Phipps, who was basically self-made, and the way he mainly made himself was he found a Spanish shipwreck off the American coast worth the modern equivalent of $20 million. Yep. Which is pretty
self-made man
baller. And also, it mentions early in that clip, what it's hinting at is why he doesn't want to appear soft on witchcraft is because having witch powers would be a good way to find a shipwreck, for instance. Yeah. To divine it. And also he had connections with a lot of trading connections and that sort of thing. It puts you under suspicion. But so yeah, he after Cotton Mather does his whitewash, Phipps is like, no more. We got the last word on that out. Nobody needs to talk about it. Let's move on. And he shadow bans. No, he does more than that. He bans discussion of the witch trials, and that is eventually broken. And we're gonna just get into the free speech element of this a little bit. And here, this is a Quaker with the last name of Mall, which you would recognize from the House of the Seven Gables. I think probably assume Hawthorne is referencing this figure. That's Matthew Mall. This is Thomas Mall. But he is a Quaker who initially was somewhat in on the witch trials, or wasn't an initial skeptic. But later became one, and he was the first person to break Phipps's ban on Salem Witch Trial stuff.
nor does Maul mention the bewitchment of his child anywhere in his writings. Given his later opposition to the trials, such an omission is not surprising. Maul also makes no mention of Samuel Parris by name in his book, though the two men's lives followed a similar path. Both were born in England, spent part of their youth in Barbados, moved to Boston, and finally settled in Salem. It is unlikely the two had ever met in Barbados, for Maul was 8 years older than Parris, and their time on the island overlapped only briefly. Yet Maul would have known Parris's type, a wealthy and privileged Puritan plantation owner. The Quaker must have been predisposed to dislike the minister. Despite Maul's initial willingness to accuse someone of witchcraft, he quickly became a critic of the witch trials. In the fall of 1695 he published Truth Held Forth and Maintained According to the Testimony of the Holy Prophets Christ and His Apostles, recorded in the Holy Scriptures, a description and defense of Quaker theological tenets and practices. It was also a stern denunciation of Massachusetts Puritan practices, particularly the cruel treatment Quakers suffered at their hands. A significant portion of the book attacks the government's handling of the Salem Witch Trials. Although the criticism is restricted to just one out of the 38 chapters of the book, it is by far the longest, more than 12% of the book. Maul saw the witch trials as God's punishment of Massachusetts for its sins, and chiefly its harsh treatment of Quakers. A recurring theme of the book is the execution of the 4 Quaker missionaries by Massachusetts Bay. Not satisfied with particulars, Maul attacked the very nature of Puritanism, blaming the colony's problems on those who consented to the rule of the priests and worshipped God the wrong way, that is, as a Puritan and not a Quaker. It was a truly courageous act for Maul to print this book under his own name and distribute it, for he did it in open opposition to the ban. In the 3 years since Governor Phipps had issued it, no one in Massachusetts had dared publish anything on the trials. Even those who criticized the proceedings before the ban had kept these works in manuscript or published them anonymously. No Massachusetts printer would undertake the printing, so Maul's book was published by William Bradford in New York, for the printer had moved there from Philadelphia in 1693. On December 12, 1695, Lieutenant Governor Stoughton, acting governor since Sir William Phipps's death, and his council issued a warrant for Maul's arrest. The complaint against Maul indicates the ban was still in effect, for the first charge noted in the warrant is that he published without license of authority. Furthermore, he had written many notorious and wicked lies and slanders not only upon private persons, but upon government, and also divers corrupt and pernicious doctrines, utterly subversive of the true Christian and professed faith. The council also ordered a search for all copies of the book. 2 days later, Chef George Corwin arrested Maul and seized and burned 31 copies of his book.
So yeah, Corwin and Stoughton very involved, some of the leaders in the trials.
On May 3, 1696, at the Superior Court's spring session in Ipswich, Maul had an angry confrontation with the judges who bound him over for trial at the fall session of the court. He would remain in prison until that session, held in Salem 5 months later, on November 11, 1696.
Anyway, Maul gets off. They let him off, which is a sign of the weakening Puritan stranglehold on society. And the big sign of that, Ann Putnam Jr. later confesses, or says sorry. She doesn't confess wholly, basically through Joseph Green, who's replaces Parris ultimately as the minister of Salem after all the witch trials, and he's able to reconcile a lot of that. But then Sewell, we get Sewell's apology. And that's where, and he was one of the judges that was responsible for sending people to the deaths. And actually, he was the richest one of them. He was super wealthy, this guy. Sewell is a name that we'll see throughout American history. I think isn't there Sewell in Lincoln's cabinet?
Yes.
But he apologizes in a very, as far as, elite accountability goes. This is in the annals of it. So.
The General Court would soon issue a long overdue apology for the witch trials, but the process would add to the political tensions. On December 2, 1696, the House of Representatives passed a bill for a day of fasting and reformation, and went so far as to order 500 copies of the proclamation written by Cotton Mather to be printed. However, the Council took offense on several counts. First, the document had been written without their consultation. Second, the focus of the document was not on witchcraft. Rather, it was another call for moral reformation, one that described a range of evils, including uncleanness, excessive drinking, vanity of dress, decay of family discipline, fraud, piracy, and even unrighteous discouragement of the magistrates and ministers of the colony.
So again, Mather's given the responsibility of writing a sort of apology for the court, and it's basically, telling people to get their own acts together.
Yeah.
And Sue was like, this isn't going to cut it.
Yeah, I'm sorry about everything, like about how society is completely decayed because of all of you.
Yeah. I'm sorry that, your covetousness made our court, hang 19 people.
Yeah.
Witchcraft was hidden within this laundry list of concerns. Wicked sorceries have been practiced in the land, and in the late inexplicable storms from the invisible world thereby brought upon us, we were left by the just hand of heaven unto those errors whereby great hardships were brought upon innocent persons, and we fear guilt incurred, which we
Mistakes were made.
have all cause to bewail with much confusion of our face before the Lord. Mather continued to minimize the sin of witchcraft, as he had in Wonders of the Invisible World. He could not even admit outright guilt for a miscarriage of justice, but had to qualify it by saying, parenthetically, we fear guilt incurred. Moreover, Matthew insisted on blaming the outbreak on the wicked sorceries, white magic such as fortune-telling, and even Mary Sibley's witch cake. Finally, the House had added to Mather's draft an exhortation to the magistrates to do a better job in prosecuting all offenders and to dispense justice equitably. As the members of the council were also the justices of the colony, this was an unacceptable slap in the face, another sign of the political tensions in the general court. The council passed its own version of a proclamation, authored by Samuel Sewell. Eventually, the House and Council would agree on Sewell's draft with some minor edits. While Mather had buried the witch trials amid a list of sins that needed forgiveness, Sewell focused on witchcraft. And especially that whatever mistakes on either hand have been fallen into, either by the body of this people or any orders of men, referring to the late tragedy raised among us by Satan and his instruments, through the awful judgment of God. He would humble us, therefore, and pardon all the errors of his servants and people that desire to love his and be atoned to his land. Sewell's wife had miscarried that past spring, and December 23rd their infant daughter Sarah died. The next day, as the family mourned, his son recited to him part of Matthew 12. Sewell remarked that the 7th verse did awfully bring to mind the Salem tragedy. But if ye had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, ye would not have condemned the guiltless. Sewell's mind was troubled from the misfortunes that beset his family. Maule's recent trial would have been a very real reminder of the witch trials, and the Quaker's verdict affirmed that he and the other judges had erred in 1692. Sewell was now convinced that God was punishing not only the colony, but him personally, for the execution of innocent victims. Thanks in part to Maule, he now knew something must be done. During the fast day service, Sewell gave Reverend Willard a letter to read to the congregation. Sewell stood before the congregation as the minister read what has come to be known as Sewell's apology.
This is good.
Samuel Sewell, sensible of the reiterated strokes of God upon himself and family, and being sensible that as to the guilt contracted upon the opening of the late commission of Oyer and Terminer at Salem, to which the order for this day relates, he is upon many accounts more concerned than any that he knows of, desires to take the blame and shame of it, asking pardon of men, and especially desiring prayers that God, who has an unlimited authority, would pardon that sin and all other his sins. It was a breathtaking act of courage, piety, and humility, for one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the colony to take responsibility for his actions and openly admit what some refused to accept and others had only hinted at. Sewell never seems to have fully forgiven himself for his involvement in the trials. According to family tradition, it was about this time that he began to wear a hair shirt. Sewell would wear this undergarment for the rest of his life. By making such a public apology, Sewell immediately made a serious enemy of William Stoughton, now, of course, acting governor of the colony. To the day he died, in 1701, Stoughton remained firm in his belief that the witchcraft court had acted properly, indeed that it had saved the colony by convicting and executing the witches. And apparently he never forgave Sewell. A year later, Stoughton snubbed Sewell when he invited all the other members of the council to a dinner party at his house.
Damn.
Stoughton's high office and his view of the trials probably kept more people from following Sewell's example.
Yeah, damn. It's like maintaining the Iraq War was the right thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, if you say that the torture was wrong, you're probably not going to go to as many dinner parties in D.C.
Yeah, and so the final sort of break in the chain to that, you have the Maule writing, then you have Sewell's apology. That leads to awesome fellow by the name of Robert Califf, who comes to write. Cotton Mather wrote Wonders of the Invisible World. Robert Califf decides to write more Wonders of the Invisible World and shit
Nice.
all over Cotton Mather. Here's some. I love Califf. I love his energy. He's a hero. Here's some of him. The last clip we'll play.
after Stoughton's death, and 2 years after Hale himself had passed away. Maule's trial and the fast day led Robert Califf, a Boston cloth merchant who had observed some of the witch trial proceedings, to write an account of the trials that would have particularly long-lasting influence. Califf was a friend of Maule's and had posted bond for him when he was arrested for writing Truth Held Forth in 1695. An Anglican, Califf had migrated to New England during the Dominion of New England, a time of religious toleration. By August 1697, Califf had completed his manuscript. Its publication was delayed until 1700, however, as his attack on the proceedings in general, and Cotton Mather in particular, was so scathing that no one in Boston was willing to undertake the printing, which had to be done in London. As the title suggests, More Wonders of the Invisible World took direct aim at Mather and his Wonders of the Invisible World.
Awesome.
Since at least 1693, Califf had been engaged in an ongoing dispute with the Mathers over witchcraft. In September of that year, he had traveled to Salem to observe Cotton Mather's efforts to heal young Margaret Rule, yet another Maine refugee who was exhibiting signs of affliction similar to what had been seen in Salem the year before. Califf wrote down an account of what he observed that night. He suggested that Rule was a fraud, and implied that Mather had inappropriately rubbed her breast and naked belly in an effort to heal her affliction by means of laying on of hands. Then Califf circulated his account to friends.
Damn.
Mather became infuriated when he heard this story, accusing Califf of lying and charging him with slander. The men exchanged a series of angry letters, where it became clear that Califf had taken liberties in his account in an effort to bait Mather.
He's a troll.
Amazingly, before Califf published his book, he first published Cotton Mather's manuscript account of Margaret Rule's affliction, followed by his exchange of letters with Mather. After this inflammatory start, Califf went on to reprint Wonders of the Invisible World, along with his own history of the trial, largely a rebuttal of Mather. Califf saw the trials as a conspiracy of the ministers and the government. A zeal governed by blindness and passion, led by increased Mather, had precipitated us into far greater wickedness, if not witchcrafts, than any have been yet proved against those that suffered. He believed that the afflicted girls and their families had been frauds, who deliberately made their accusations for personal gain and to harm their enemies. Califf's anger shows through in the satirical edge to his writing. The book is far from measured and reasoned. Cotton Mather complained bitterly about this vile volume, consisting of an abominable bundle of lies, written to vilify me and render me incapable to glory the Lord Jesus Christ. One can imagine the Mathers' outrage at the accusation that they had conspired with Governor Phipps to manipulate the outbreak, especially considering that Lady Mary Phipps and Maria Mather had been cried out upon. Increase showed his disdain by having a copy of the book burned in Harvard Yard. For all its faults, Califf's book clearly demonstrated the younger Mather's duplicity in defending the government in Wonders of the Invisible World. Califf pointed out that when the trials began, Mather was one of the ministers who had urged caution in the use of spectral evidence, yet a year later defended the judges for their actions. Essentially, Califf threw mud at Mather, and by extension the witchcraft judges and the government of Massachusetts, and it contained enough truth to stick. Califf's work helped expose the cover-up.
Yeah, so shout out to Robert Califf there. A historian, I'm not sure if I have the reference here. Historian Samuel Eliot Morrison famously said, Robert Califf, who had it in for Cotton Mather, tied a tin can to him after the frenzy was over, and it rattled and banged through the pages of superficial and popular historians. And like I said, the Califf was, he thought all of the accusers were like harlots, basically, and liars. And I think we have a bit more. I think some of them were liars. But I think the hysteria and the PTSD and all that stuff definitely plays into it well. But he was not afraid to go at the Mather and took him down.
Well, yeah, I think it only further displays the shift that had occurred in the colonial culture at that time, where all of a sudden there's this person throwing out evidence upon evidence of what had actually happened, being like, and mocking someone for suggesting that, the unseen world is responsible for this.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about some of one of the spookier instances we teased earlier? The blood to drink.
Oh yeah. We keep circling around this story because it's a good one.
It's crazy, and this is by tradition. I haven't seen the solid evidence that proves this, but it seems true. So this is from Storm of Witchcraft, page 32. And so Sarah Good, one of the Sarah's Good and Osborne were the first two women accused, and Sarah Good told Salem Town's junior minister Nicholas Noyes. Noyes gave Sarah one last chance to confess that she was a witch. so that she would at least not die a liar. And she says, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. And if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Now, we mentioned, I think, in one episode that was said to Hawthorne's father, and there's a tradition that it was, but it was to Noyes. Although it very well could have been to Haythorne, because Haythorne was a fucking awful questioner himself. So, I mean...
Yeah, it's possible he was in the room,
exactly. Too. Like, the spirit of it was meant for all those guys, right? And I'll just say the end of that story there. Good drew her last words from the Bible, specifically Revelation 16:6. During the apocalypse, God punished sinners through 7 final plagues, the third of which turned all the rivers and springs of water into blood. For they shed the blood of the saints and prophets, and therefore thou hast given them blood to drink. After Sarah's final words, the executions took place without further incident, though people remembered Good's curse years later when Noyes suffered an internal hemorrhage, leaving him to die choking on his own blood. Yeah, it doesn't actually cite how we know that he choked on his own blood there, but that's what, I mean, I think Emerson Baker shows skepticism of a lot of different narratives. For instance, that the girls involved were practiced witchcraft beforehand. There's not a super abundance of evidence of that.
That's something in Salem Possessed that they had taken as a given.
Yeah.
That it's putting an egg shell in a small bowl of water, right? And that's like their form of like a crystal ball. They can see images into the future.
Or a glass, yeah. And I think that did happen, but it wasn't like the Paris girls. And like that's the only thing that there's any evidence for, and that might not even happen. But basically the folk witchcraft was, you break an egg into a glass and then look at the way the white or the yolk, I'm not sure.
I think it's the white, yeah.
And in this story, it was a coffin. But I think we covered a lot of the good context for the Salem Witch Trials there. I mean, the end of the Puritan theocracy, the rise of mercantile capitalism. Anything else you want to mention, Alex?
Well, in the name of context, do you want me to? I can go over witch trials in Europe.
Yeah, sure.
If we'll zigzag through time here, quick. But when you think of the Salem Witch Trials would have been probably the last big gasp of popular witch trials in North American and European history.
Yep.
But it's not something that was necessarily a mainstay of European history. In fact, when the Catholic Church was making its way out of Rome and into Europe and Northern Europe in like 306, they had like a synod of Elvira that was basically saying if you're caught practicing witchcraft, it's 5 years of penance. And 5 years of penance is like very undefined. It's like just relax for the most part. And
chill.
Yeah, and like witchcraft is like interchangeable with being a pagan. There's not like you're casting spells or anything like that. They're like, if we catch you doing this, just don't.
Yeah.
And then by 785, there's the Council of Paderborn, which is saying that if you're caught burning a witch to death, you die. You're out. Because this keeps happening in like
the pro witch lobby, write that law.
Yeah. But they're like this. They're trying to be this kind of like rationalizing force in the world, because from their perspective, like God has come back through Jesus Christ, and the idea that you could get power through the devil is ridiculous to them, because they're like, we already won this battle, so you can't get power from the devil. So now it's like these every one-off witch trials keep happening in like the 700s in different European kingdoms, and they're like. The Pope is basically like, listen, all right, if I catch you burning a witch, you're dead. You're out. Oh, there's a quote here from the Lombard Codes, which is a law code in France, which is, quote, "Let nobody presume to kill a foreign serving maid or female servant as a witch, for it is not possible, nor ought to be believed by Christian minds." Yeah. And then in 866, the Catholic Church outlaws torture completely. So there's no physical torture for anything at all. Although, I mean, the huge caveat
bunch of wusses. Yeah. They don't have a war on terror to win.
The caveat is this is happening all the time in Europe, and even like executed by the Catholic Church. But they're trying to be like, let's not do this.
Right. Yeah.
So
fake it before you make it.
Yeah. So around like the 1200s, what we would call like the high medieval era, there are essentially no pagans anymore. most of the European continent, with the exception of the Iberian Peninsula, is under like the Christendom yoke. But there's like the first offshoot of what we would now call Protestantism emerging out of France, and it's called there's these groups called the Cathars, Waldensians, and the Hussites. And it doesn't really matter what they're into, but there's this hyper educated for the time group that's saying, oh, like we went to the Sorbonne, or we went to the Oxford or whatever, and like we actually don't need the liturgy of the Catholic Church. We can just celebrate on our own. Right. And the church had a big
open source.
Yeah, church had a big problem with this. So they created what are called the Friars, which I'm sure everyone knows about, like
the Friars Club. They do the roast.
Yeah, exactly. And the Friars, like, these are these hyper educated people that are going to meet, like, because the problem with that Cathars were so successful is that they would debate priests in public and win. So they were like they would
own them with facts and logic.
Yeah, I was about to say they're like the Ben Shapiro's being, well, actually, like if you look, there's no reference to the Holy Spirit or communion in the Bible. So the Catholic Church makes this new group of people, which are called the Friars. And this is where like the problem comes in, because these are like hyper educated people who go into urban centers in Europe, and they open up things which are called the Inquisition. And it's a way of getting people within Christendom to be like, you need to conform to our rules. And they essentially wipe all these people out. They even have a crusade in Europe, which most people, we don't really talk about. But one of the last crusades was just Europeans killing other Europeans.
Oh, yeah. So it wasn't like the good one, whereas Europeans slaughtering Muslims.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
which we can all get behind.
All the Deus Vult people on Twitter seem to forget that one, where the most successful one was just murdering Frenchmen.
Yeah, it was just to make Europe for Europe.
Yeah. So these friars are extremely successful. Done. It's over. Unfortunately, this group still exists, so it's kind of like NATO, where they're like, well, what do they do now? Mm-hmm. And all the friars, what they want,
creep.
Yeah, they want to expand this Inquisition, which is a group, or which is an office that still exists. And they said, well, you know what the real problem is? It's witchcraft. Yeah. Because that's gone completely under the radar for like 700 years. So there's three like major problems that happen, which are the 100 Years' War throws Europe into a cultural or a like political disaster with hundreds of thousands of people dead. The Black Death from 1347 to 1351 kills about 75 million people. And so the medieval order had completely collapsed on itself. There's no outside problem anymore. They just took over everything, and then it just bottomed out.
Could have been witches, though.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because there were a lot of people that said, you know what this is?
That's what I thought.
This is witches.
It's that witches.
So there was this... So with the reordering of Europe, all of a sudden there's the idea of like the state becomes like a viable option, and there's like the in-group, out-group mentality. And so they bring in all these friars to be like, we've got to get people into lockstep, and the best way to do that for like, we're the French nation, or we're the Holy Roman Empire, or we're the English nation, is to get these witches out of here. So in the early 1400s, there's a rise of like witch burnings throughout Europe, but it's still one-offs. It's like everyone like in the town get together, we're going to kill this woman, she's a witch, done. 1428, that's when the first like witch trial happens, which is in Valais, and there's the last of like the Waldensians, which are those groups of like early Protestants. It's happening around then, where the friars like, let's expand this out because we think that there are witches here. Mm-hmm. And it turns out they find over 200 witches and kill them all in like a 5-year period.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah. So in 1450, the printing press is invented, and within 10 years of the printing press being invented, 15 books on witchcraft come out.
Oh man, what was like big on the internet?
It would be like 9/11 conspiracy,
9/11
like
conspiracy.
web pages.
Yeah. That's hilarious. Like the only like non-Bible like literature basically seems like witch books.
So the Catholic Church is freaking out about this, because they're like, this is getting a little out of hand. And woodcuts are also invented, which is the first massed form like art, because it's indentation, and then you just copy it hundreds of times. And like the black cat, the black cat that's with it, and the witch's broom all come from this period, because they just print these books as fast as possible with these. And it's like, this is what a witch looks like, by the way. And it's like, it looks like a servant, by the way.
Right.
So in 1487, this is like when it really takes off, is the Malleus Maleficarum is published by a Dominican friar, and that's that's in English the Hammer of Witches, and that's banned by the Catholic Church. But at that time, the there's a number of like different Bibles being printed that are also being banned, and everyone's like, forget this. And the problem with banning printed books is once in late medieval Europe is to ban them, you still have to buy them first, and that just pays for.
Explain that a little bit.
So this like the idea of printing was a foreign concept, especially for people in power, and so because the idea of like a book, a folio text before that is it would be commissioned from someone who's very valuable, who would buy it ahead of time for you to make it, and it would take 10 or whatever years to make.
This is like the Shakespeare folios.
Before that, but but it's being written by hand.
Right.
It's being created by hand, and it takes quite a long time. And it's a beautiful art piece object. It took a very long time for like the Catholic Church and for different leaders to understand how to ban printed books, because they would see them on the market and they'd say, let's buy all these up and destroy them. Unfortunately, that just paid for the next printing.
Yeah,
so
they were looking for their own version of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act.
Yeah, they couldn't. There was no law to just like, we need to get this off the market. They were just like, well, let's just buy it off the market. But unfortunately, you just paid for 300 more copies. So we'll go to like the 1500s, like, and they really start like getting massive. So like in Germany, which is like right after the 30 Years' War, which is essentially demolished the Holy Roman Empire, like for any 1 in 3 people are going to either die or be affected by the 30 Years' War. And right after that, in 1587, 500 people were burned to death in a 5-year period in TO Germany. 1590, James VI of Scotland got involved in the North Burrough Witch Trials. And he's famous because he would become James I. So he's the first monarch who was directly involved in witch trials. And he wrote a book himself called Demonology, which is the history of demons on Earth. And that was a primary source for Shakespeare's Macbeth.
Can you imagine being around like in those times and reading shit like that?
Yeah.
And, I mean, it'd be fascinating and exhilarating.
But terrifying.
Terrifying.
But so Shakespeare used this demonology book when he wrote Macbeth, and we think now the chants that the Weird sisters give are from that book. So he did it as a way to freak audiences out, being like
double bubble, toil and trouble.
Yeah, those are real curses. So supposedly when people heard that, they like left the theater being like, what are you doing?
Awesome. Shakespeare's a real one.
Yeah, he's a real dude. So that's probably like the peak of...
I should say Francis Bacon. No, I'm joking.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Yeah. That's the peak probably of witch mania in Europe, where there's a monarch of a major nation like Europe is writing books about demons, and then they're writing plays quoting those books. And this is right before Puritans take over. So right in like 1600s, like there's like legal and theological protests against witch trials, where it's like, this is like people will show up in friars will show up in towns, or inquisitors, and 500 people are going to die. So it's like, this is absolutely absurd. Yeah. So as witch trials begin to fade because of this blowback in Europe, they really start taking off in America and Nordic countries for some reason. And then there's what we covered, the Salem Witch Trials, and after that, that's kind of the last big gasp. And in 1735, so about 30 years after the Salem Witch Trials, there's the Witchcraft Act in England, which is if you accuse anyone of being a witch, that's a crime now, because they have to like put they finally have to put a stop to all this. And so the last witch to be killed in Europe was in 1782, which is in Sweden, which is kind of insane to think about. There are witches that are killed in different parts of the world today. But for like the European kind of witch craze from about late 1300s to 1782, we think probably about 40,000 to 60,000 people were burned at the stake, executed in some way or the other. And it's probably about 90 to 95% women. Mm-hmm. So it's just like, it's good to remember that, like, especially when we talked about like form and how the form changes, but the essence kind of stays the same over time. Like it's important to note that like the movement is some sort of like patriarchal hatred.
Yeah, and I think the line between misogyny is very clear in all this. Mm-hmm. One work I didn't cite in this, and I need to re-review in the future, but I didn't for this because it's mainly focused on European witchcraft, but Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici.
Yeah.
Sort of Marxist take on all this. And I think actually her numbers are a bit higher and not in terms of the number of people killed. And,
yeah, that's a pretty, I would say 60,000 is pretty conservative.
But I think hers, I've seen critiques of it that she goes too high, but I think the fundamental point that this is this was basically done in sort of a subconscious construction of a patriarchal sort of, I guess, Western civilization or Christendom.
Yeah.
And yeah, that women, and you look at it with all the different signs of witchcraft, right? Like the broomstick, you're flying on a broomstick to different meetings, or pins. Like I'm being stuck with pins, or one of the famous witches in the early 1600s in Europe vomited pins. Apparently, it was like a magic trick, basically. But it's definitely true that like you look and then women were, if they had miscarriages, those they were accused of killing their children very often, which is like very, you look at the way America, big chunks of America want to cut down on abortion rights. Well, what you're going to eventually happen then is you're going to be looking askance with a side eye at women who had miscarriages that weren't planned, right? Like, did they actually abort their kid? That's going to be, that's what's around the corner when you go towards a more anti-choice world.
Well, it's like that law in Georgia that said a miscarriage qualifies as manslaughter.
Right.
Which to me, like, so you put the woman in jail, like, I don't see how that is in function, how that is that much different to what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's less mystical, perhaps.
Yeah.
But it's the exact same impulse. It's driven by the same motivations.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think, Caliban the Witch, you can find that PDF online if you want that. But, yeah, I mean, it's a horrifying period in American history.
Well, there's something, especially when you see it all back to back like that. There's something about, there's some sort of like turmoil that's happening in the culture at that moment. And there's some sort of patriarchal id urge to cleanse yourself of this problem. And so you have like the sacrificial lamb, which seems to be part of like culture from the beginning of the written word. And it just so happens that like, well, the sacrificial lamb is going to be the weakest among us, or the one that we take advantage of the most. And it's going to be these women of low station. And that's what it's a pattern that keeps repeating itself for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah. I mean, and again, just to bring up the like, I think it was Sarah Good, maybe it was Sarah Osborne, but one of them, where she was a beggar. I think it was Good. Yeah. Cause she begged with her daughter, 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas Good. And, but she was in earlier in life, she was expecting a higher station and things went wrong. And she would go around begging for people, and then whether she got what she wanted or whether she didn't, she would mutter. And it's implied that this is some sort of like Tourette's type situation going on with her. And I have been thinking every time I've seen somebody sleeping on the street or opening doors asking for change in like downtown Brooklyn, is the way we look at those people as they are dehumanized. Yeah. And it's what in a Puritan context, what is a dehumanized person but like, a servant of the devil. And like, and she probably can't help the way she mutters. Yeah. And she's clearly going through some sort of like mental illness. And I think that's a lot of this. A lot of this is, it's a confluence of, I think, actual like adolescent psychopathy among the accusers, and actual like how they interpret like, oh, I'm twitching now. Like who is that but Satan, right? Like if God authors everything but the bad things, the author of this has to be Satan.
Well, then we also created a society that reflects the perfection of God's glory quite well. So to see those like the seams of that society being like, well, we either can restructure society to be more egalitarian, or we can get rid of what we assume are problems within the society. And it's obvious what people choose, what men of power choose, which is like, well, let's get rid of these people with less power that make me have to think about this.
Yeah. So bit of a downer. It's more of a depressing than spooky. I feel like when you actually dig into this.
Well, I think that's the literary hangover ethos, which is like, this thing that's spooky. It's actually
It's
depressing.
actually just depressing.
Yeah.
It's a depressing story of empire.
Yeah.
It's not ghosts and goblins. But I don't know if there's anything else in my notes that I wanted to get to. I just want to mention Phipps since we won't talk about him. Oh, no, I did mention that he made his $20 million
Finding a
shipwreck.
Yeah.
So, folks, we are cruising along on Literary Hangover. The YouTube page is growing fast. We'll be doing the Crucible, I think, in the next few weeks, hopefully. And then some more things. Actually, I do want to recommend a Netflix show called Marianne. My girlfriend and I have been watching it on it's a French show. It's in it's subtitled, but it's on a witch.
Yeah.
Marianne. Also, Hereditary is good too. If people haven't checked that out.
Yeah.
I'm down for witch. I want more witch stuff. I think this Salem shit, the Salem Town versus Salem Village, everything surrounding it. I've thought this about pretty much everything we've researched on the show, but this should definitely be given an HBO miniseries treatment.
Yeah.
I'd watch 10 solid episodes on, everything we've talked about today. I think it needs to happen because I think you understand a lot about the American experience when you look at this. Alex, do you have anything else you want to mention?
Yeah, if I can put one more button on that, is when reading about, because I knew about the outline of the Salem Witch Trials, but I don't think I could know I wouldn't say I knew the finer details. Definitely didn't know there were two Salems before we started researching. Yeah. But
doing the classic rural-urban divide.
Yeah, thing, the specter that continues to haunt the American psyche. But it's interesting when you think about the Salem. To me, it feels like a kind of a founding event of the American story. And it's almost like there are two kinds of events in history. Ones that the people at the time are like, look what we did. Look, keep reading. And then there's events that are just as important. That's do not look at this. It's not important. And it's kind of it calls just as much attention to it because there's something Salem is absolutely 100% in the popular culture despite their best efforts.
Yeah.
And it's every, if you look at a cop car and in Salem, you'll see a witch on it, which doesn't necessarily mean that the message went through, but at least the form is there.
Yeah.
And there's something about truth will out, this, as important as the Declaration of Independence and the War of Independence is. To me, this is just as an important story to understanding 100%. America.
Yeah.
There are two foundings, almost one in 1692 and one in 1776.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. John Adams also, to tie those two things together, in the John Adams miniseries, he's defending those British soldiers. Is that the Boston Massacre?
Yep.
Yeah, Adams had served as defense attorney for the British soldiers. It had been an unpopular move, but the future president considered it his duty, for a, quote, judgment of death against those soldiers would have been as foul a stain upon this country as the executions of the Quakers or witches anciently. Which is, I think, an amazing, sign of memory. And how memory is lived by the people. 100 years after that, for the 200-year anniversary of Salem, there's still enough people in Salem Town and maybe Danvers. I'm not sure where this was localized, but they were against any kind of memorial.
Yeah.
So skepticism, I think they were witches though.
Yeah. Or the common thing, which is we all know it was bad. You don't have to stick our eye in it.
Yeah, ancient history. Hey, look, we got to turn the page.
Exactly.
Turn the page on the witches. We don't.
Yeah, get out of here, devils.
Look, these are nice Harvard folks.
Yeah.
Many of them might be in my cabinet. They got some merchants there. Do some business. Alex, thank you so much for your assistance on this show today.
Yeah, another good one.
I think so. And folks, become a patron. Just do it.
Just do it. Yeah.
Just do it now.
Really, I don't know why
Do it right now. I don't know what you're waiting for. We just gave you a bunch of free podcasts. So until next time, bye bye.
See ya.